This is a version of a talk that I gave at the British Society for Research in the Learning of Mathematics on November the 6th, 2021. I start by thanking the organisers of the conference for inviting me to give this talk, which is about my recent book. Care in Mathematics Education, Alternative Educational Spaces and Practices, published by Palgrave Macmillan. In their series, Palgrave Studies in Alternative Education. Now, when I was first invited to write this book, my reaction was that I didn't know anything about alternative education, which I understood to be the current term for educating children with needs that cannot be met in mainstream schools. However, when I read the aims of this series, I found that they were interested in educational practices done with voice, choice, freedoms, and interpersonal thoughtfulness. Now, a long time ago, I'd imagined in conversation with Mike Askew that I might one day write something about the role of love in mathematics teaching. I was a teacher at the time and felt that love was an important component of my work. Without love, how can teachers maintain their inner strength, especially when teaching is made more difficult by outside circumstances? Recently, I've noticed the word love popping up in various places. For instance, it is in this book by Francis Su, the ex-president of the Mathematics Association of America, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. And it also pops up in Tony Cotton's editorial in a recent issue of Mathematics Teaching. Teaching mathematics should be an act of love, not an imposition of power. The invitation to write a book about maths education that embraced interpersonal thoughtfulness was a reminder of the central driver of my work when I was a teacher and since. Now, this talk runs the risk of turning into a sermon, but I'm prepared to take that risk. Self-harm and suicide statistics amongst school children have risen hugely over the last 6 years. And maybe methods of recording these have improved, but even so, there have been worrying rises. Education has to take this into account and be part of the improvement rather than only part of the patching up. And mathematics education in particular has to be part of the improvement, as it's a subject in which learners can find again and again that their thoughts, their efforts, and their understanding are never quite good enough. Mathematics anxiety is a thing. So I began to write this book and found very soon that my focus shifted from love as an abstract idea to care as the enactment of love in educational spaces. All teachers care. I found it was important to understand what was cared for, as well as how care is enacted. As researchers, you care, I assume, for truth and have to make choices about the ingredients, context, applicability, generalizability, robustness, and standards of truth. You also care about the ethics of your research, and ethical care is part of work in all professions, including teachers. And by ethical care, I mean our work conforms to a set of principles that balance truth, the ways of finding truth, and a do no harm principle that recognizes vulnerability of the people involved in research. Now, from time to time, research is used in ways that do harm that researchers could not have imagined. The search for truth and publication of truth can be twisted to suit aims and impositions beyond the original context. I haven't written about care for educational research, however, But if you want to know more, you could look at the article by Camilla Gilmore, Ruth Trundley, Julia Van Muller, and Erosena Dudavu in a recent issue of Mathematics Teaching, and it's available online free. But this is a deviation back to my book. I hope to balance the ethical professional care that all teachers have for learners and the care that is driven by their internal personal care for their students and for their mathematics. Their personal care for their students and for mathematics are confluent. The care for the learning of mathematics. But teachers also have to care about the context in which their learners live. And the current context in most countries is the learning of what I call European heritage school mathematics, sometimes referred to as Western mathematics, which is daft. Where's the West in relation to where you're standing now? EHSM for short, and it's colonial. It's mainly been spread by European-centered empires. This is a mathematics that focuses strongly on the correct performance of calculations, the correct recall and use of facts from the mathematical canon, and these were often taught for clerical purposes. Another empire thing maybe. Calculations that can now be done far faster and more accurately by machines, and facts that are available with a few clicks, so long as the chosen website is mathematically reliable. And there's a political equation that connects mathematical achievement in international tests with national economic viability, and it strikes terror into the hearts of politicians whose response in many countries, including England, is to try to take charge of mathematics. That's the reality. So it's part of the professional responsibility of teachers to take account of it. Mathematics achievement, by whatever the high stakes standards are, is a social justice issue. But also maths, I recognize, does actually give access to science, engineering, many forms of employment, and creative and innovative endeavors, and the power to understand the data and statistics that control our lives, and, for example, our responses to climate crisis and other emergencies. Maths is also empowering for individuals and communities, so it's needed by everyone, not only as a gatekeeper to further study and employment, but also as a real tool for understanding and even manipulating what affects us. Now, to think about care in education, we have to read the seminal work of Nell Noddings, an educational philosopher who used to be a secondary mathematics teacher and now writes extensively about care. There is much that is important and interesting about the role that care plays in our individual and collaborative lives. For example, she says, when I care, I really hear, see, or feel what the other is trying to convey. I give her a bit of a rough ride in my book, and I'll tell you why. Her care for students as individuals trying to make their way in the world leads her to suppose that not everybody needs to study all branches of mathematics. She supposes that many only need to study the mathematics that is going to be of use to them in their future lives, as if they know what those are going to be like. Being forced to study algebra, trigonometry, and calculus, she says, inevitably leads to superficial teaching that is devoid of meaning, purpose, and motivation for adolescents. What is more important, according to her, is that individuals should be able to make choices And then when she was writing, as perhaps now, many would choose not to continue with mathematics or only to study some statistics, some arithmetic, and maybe some measuring of various kinds. She was writing in the US context in which mathematics in some areas is still chopped up into algebra 1, algebra 2, and so on. I disagree. I cannot think of one good argument that would exclude systematically people from the potential intellectual and creative power that could be the outcome of mathematics education, particularly if that exclusion is disguised as personal choice, which is often uninformed, or the result of education and experience, which has consistently failed to offer any sense or purpose or excitement. Teachers who care about learners and about mathematics aim to bring both together through the processes of learning. They do not aim to exclude anyone. I knew I had to find some way of describing care for the learning of mathematics that related to the abstract idea of love, in addition to, but not instead of, the all too concrete idea of getting the next imposed high stakes test result. Where could I go to get started? In my career, I've learned most about mathematics education when I bring home insights and perceptions that have developed in an unfamiliar context. So with that in mind, and knowing several international maths educators who would help me, I began to seek the stories and practices of people who were teaching mathematics in indigenous communities. Traditional mathematical ideas in these communities do not follow EHSM priorities. Rather, they follow local needs for survival and local understandings of what is meant by knowledge and learning, or knowing. Often these are collaborative enculturations taking place within traditional social milieu, using the local language and behavioral norms. EHSM then provides the external validation of educational progress, giving access to higher education and employment in the outer worlds of provincial and national jurisdiction. Indigenous communities know this. Their leaders want their children to do well by EHSM standards, but without the forced removal of traditional habits and values that have done so much damage to past generations. And I found reports of work in New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Canada, Honduras, and the United States, in which EHSM maths was taught with respect for and alongside other local forms of knowledge. Sometimes a local concern or activity would be used merely as a context for learning arithmetic in our number system. Sometimes traditional objects and materials were used in place of the plastic manipulables with which we are all familiar, to a greater or lesser extent appropriate. There was one example where someone referred to a teepee as a cone when it's actually somebody's home. That was daft as calling a house a cuboid. Sometimes a project would be locally meaningful, but needed EHSM for added power. I began to understand that neither of these knowledge structures needed to be imposed on the other. Instead, they were entwined, very often through discussion between the teachers and the cultural elders. In the talk at BSRLM, I had a lovely photograph that I used of a community maths lesson in a big hall, and the children were around on a carpet with adults with them, and then sitting around in chairs were other adults, and the adults included teachers from outside, teachers from inside the community, and cultural elders. I couldn't show it to you because of protecting the children's images on this medium. A major example of entwinement, which some of you will know about because it's the source of several research papers, is the development of EHSM in Maori culture. So that ideas that are imported from Maori, ideas that are important in Maori and imported into mathematics from Maori, such as symmetry and journey, are embedded in mathematics teaching alongside European ideas of counting and naming. Another example is the school curriculum. This is an accessible paper that you can get fairly easily online that will summarize some of those processes. Most of the work published from that study is headed by Bill Barton, but it's Uniku Fairhall, who is the Maori mathematics teacher at the heart of the project. Another example is the school curriculum developed by Jerry Lipka, working over more than 2 decades with the Yupik notion in Alaska, when he began to understand traditional Yupik views of quantity and dimensionality and developed a curriculum to match that. In his work, it's really, really important to have the entwinement, because obviously the way of life of Alaskan Yupik people is being radically affected by global warming. Here's a relatively accessible paper that can express that. In a less well published body of work, with the Mi'kmaq Nation in Quebec and Maine, Lisa Looney Borden discovered that verbs were much more important in Mi'kmaq language than nouns. So the naming of shapes was much less important than the possible actions and properties of shapes. A student complained to her that she kept giving them the names of things, but not showing them what they do. One lovely example was a cube wasn't named as a cube, it was sits still, was the description of a cube. You can think about that, because obviously if you turn it onto its vertex, it doesn't sit still anymore. So then you get the need for analyzing its properties and what those do. The importance of verbs crops up in many indigenous forms of knowledge. And I suspect that some children in our own schools have difficulties with mathematical ideas because very often they don't know what those ideas do, how those ideas behave. All they might know is what they are supposed to do. The fundamental ideas of symmetry, journey, and actions contrast with the EHSM starting point of discrete number and counting. Not only is entwinement necessary for educating in Indigenous communities, but it also points to some important fundamentals about my understanding of my place and my interactions in the world, wherever I am, fundamentals that seem to be laid aside in the teaching of mathematics. In addition, a lot of the teaching I read about requires listening to learners and knowing the difference between pinning ideas down with technical language, rather than the movement-based interactions with the world that could help. I expect early years specialists will recognize this also. So I came out of my reading about Indigenous communities with some insights that I think are important much more generally. First of all, care for the outside community within which this school and these children become educational spaces. I'll let you read this. Those of you who work in early years and P stage 1 will recognize these as well understood connections of early learning of mathematics, connections that may have been written out of the statutory curriculum for some extraordinary reason. I'm saying that these connections go well beyond early years for all of these. For instance, I've imagined trigonometry, calculus, and algebra so dismissed by Noddings and realized that all of these central ideas in mathematics are accessible through entwinement of the kinds talked about here. Then there has to be a care for mathematics using the precise language, the symbols, the dialogue to describe and reason and clarify. The coordination of multiple meanings and uses of number. And the using of verbs instead of nouns to describe and elaborate concepts. I remember David Pym a long time ago talking about the difference between teaching equating and equations. And the central role of our fundamental understandings of space, including balance, symmetry, pattern, position, and measurement. And there has to also be care for learning through relationships, through mutual respect, through learning how to learn in school. We all have to learn what school learning is and how to do it, and it's harder for some than for others. And whether and how teachers bring themselves into their work, such as being alongside learners, and tenderness about learners' identity, their senses of shame, and their priorities, and the holistic nature of coming to know anything, the social, the language, the spatial, the emotional aspects of coming to know anything. And yarning to reflect on learning, where yarning is an Aboriginal way of expressing the telling stories to each other about what it is we know and how we came to know it, and comparing those different experiences of coming to know it. I like the idea of yarning. And something came to me while I was summarizing all this, was that the idea of care for cognition, cognitive care. I care about how you might come to understand this bit of maths and how you are coming to understand this bit of maths. I contrast cognitive care with cognitive control, which is the belief that if I as teacher behave in certain ways, your cognitive processes will be controlled in such a way that you will learn mathematics. Now, with cognitive control, you are likely to learn some mathematical recitations and procedures and structures even, but you might not become an autonomous and active mathematical learner. Now, still believing that by going into unfamiliar contexts, I would continue to learn about care, I decided to find out about the possibilities for caring about the learning of mathematics that exist in some contexts in England, but were not controlled by the state. In other words, what is possible without state control of curriculum, inspection, testing, sometimes defining the nature of mathematics, and now even sometimes defining preferred pedagogies. I went far and wide into sixth form teaching in higher achieving independent schools, into a therapeutic school for children with very serious emotional and behavioral difficulties, into some homeschool situations. When I say went into, this was of course curtailed by lockdown. So some of this was interview and discussion. In all these educational spaces, I found teachers whose care for the learning of mathematics was characterized in ways that overlapped with those that I found in Indigenous communities. When care for mathematics was present in conjunction with caring for learners. Listening to learners was of primary importance rather than talking to. There was space and time and flexibility to respond to learners' ideas, to their language, and to sense making. Teaching could be adapted to support learning. Teachers worked with what students brought into the educational space. Their emotional and social selves had a place in the classroom and in mathematics learning. And the design and choice of tasks prioritized meaning making through multiple materials and representations. Resources were often more prolific. The outside was often used as a source of mathematization. Teachers and learners would often work side by side, and learners would have influence over pace. Teachers expected learners to have the capacity for abstract reasoning and supported their developing capabilities. In this picture, for instance, it's perfectly clear who is doing the talking, who is doing the meaning making, who is expressing, and it's perfectly clear who is being attended to by the other people in the group. Learners' interests and strengths could take priority over curriculum norms in the shorter term, like in this discussion, seen in the picture, and the immediate classroom dynamics, while curriculum norms were nevertheless respected in the medium term. How do we stay, in some sense, on track? I think I'd show you this slide as well, which is in an independent context, school context. And you might like to try and work out who the teacher is. It's not too difficult. He's wearing a tie. And you might like to think about to whom most of the students are listening and who is at the board, who's writing some maths, what are they reading? And okay, there's two boys who seem to be doing something under the table, and the teacher is looking at the lesson plan to see how we're getting on. But this had to be a book that is very much about what teaching is like, can be like now, here, in the background mainstream context that I describe in the early chapters of my book. For example, the imposition of superficially applied results in cognitive science as is described as part of the context. So it would have been no good whatsoever to write a book that merely talked about what's possible outside state control. For me, the most joyful chapter is chapter 8, where I talk about how full of care, the learning of mathematics is being exercised in individual classrooms and other educational spaces within the maintained system. Now, I don't know why I'm talking at a research conference about a book that is not based on systematic inquiry, but on anecdote offered as proof of concept. I don't know if you'll accept that as a form of research. This is not what my previous academic research was like at all, but I've decided that it's important and necessary. That ethnographic approach has been not as exercised as fully as it could have been to discover really good mathematics teaching in this country at this time. Yes, it is possible, even in our current climate, to teach with care for the learning of mathematics as an outward expression of love for both students and mathematics. And I found several examples where I could visit classrooms or watch videos or interview teachers about what they thought could be meant by care for the learning of mathematics and how they went about it. I find this the hardest chapter to talk about because the teachers in it are all so different. There isn't a recipe for how they teach. They are all successful in terms of test results and value-added measures in their contexts. Some of the teachers do things that some of the teachers might never do. The enactment of care is holistic, and it cannot be boiled down to a list of instructions for pedagogy. However, there are some commonalities. Learners' individual cognition is treated as an integral part of their whole selves and their current lives. Teachers provide an environment in which responsibility for and control of the direction of mathematical ideas flows between teachers and students, depending on the mathematical thinking that takes place and the ideas that arise from the class. Teacher prepares initial tasks and goals, adapting and extending as the lessons unfold. And interactions, both planned and spontaneous, support individual and class thinking. I had some difficulty when finding teachers. I found two who told me that they couldn't act with care as much as they wanted to because they had to follow scripted lessons. They could not deviate from someone else's plan. In chapter 8, I have no examples of people teaching totally enforced lesson scripts. And I want to ask, how can there be care when the teacher cannot listen or respond with care to learners? If the teacher is listening and responding with care, you can't stick to a script. You can stick to a plan. You can stick to a plan over several lessons, but you can't stick to a script. The teachers that I found and talked with, it turned out had all taken steps to maintain their personal mathematical learning in various ways since becoming teachers, either by taking courses or by working on mathematical puzzles on their own or with others, or a maths jam community, or in working with colleagues, setting little tasks in the staff room, that kind of thing. And care for their own mathematics informed their pedagogy. They were all sustained by passion, by compassion, by ethics, by care, and by commitment to social justice and love, I would say. They prioritized students' thinking because they had no alternative ways of teaching. They couldn't understand how to teach if you didn't prioritize the students' thinking. All of them talked explicitly or implicitly about building a contract, maybe a new kind of contract with learners. Not teacher shows and student follows, but different kinds of engagement, giving time and support for thinking. Several of them talked about wanting students to think hard and realizing that that required them to give space, time, and support to thinking. They avoided rushing. They seemed able to focus on habits of learning and habits of inquiry and habits of discovery, even when the task was to work through a list of examples about the use of a technique or a list of examples carefully constructed to reveal or expose a concept. But all these processes were supported by interactions that were about reasoning, about making connections, about recognizing what's relevant and how it is relevant. They cared for the development of learners' minds. Listening guided the teacher's knowledge of learners' mathematical minds, not application of a limited theory of mind being used to guide teaching. Now, the word alongside has played a role in the book because it began to offer me a non-divisive, non-hierarchical way of seeing relationships between people in classrooms. And not only between people in classrooms, but also between formal and informal mathematics, between the physical positions of teacher and student or peer learners, between the need for directed learning and the development of inquiry and discovery habits, or both of those, all of those contributing towards developing mathematics in an autonomous and independent mindset. And relationships between the academic, emotional, and social development of learners. All of these happen alongside each other. Now, every bit of ethnographic research has to end up with some kind of framework for organizing what has been found out. Now, in that shaded area, care for mathematics and care for the learner, these teachers were not filling it with efficiency and optimization, even though those yardsticks are necessary with the institutional constraints of funding, timetabling, curriculum coverage, and testing regimes, which tend to dominate pedagogy. Rather, these teachers were filling that space with listening, talking, and establishing trust. The teacher provides deliberately planned contexts and tasks and interacts with spontaneous responses that value, encourage, and respond to and expand learners' mathematical thinking, all in the classroom milieu. But that mathematical thinking is influenced from outside as well as from the classroom by the personal lives of learners, but also by everyday outside mathematics, the lives of the mathematics that exists in the lives of people outside the mathematics classroom, and maybe outside the school too. And all of that exists within a particular culture and a community. The teachers sustain their work through pedagogical habits that are themselves sustained by their belief in the students' potential powers of mathematical thought. The book is not a manifesto, and I hope this talk has not sounded like a sermon. It builds up to descriptions of actual practices that are possible now, that are happening here and now, and that work. Thank you.